My name is Adelina, and I never thought I could sink this deep into my own weakness. I am the wife of a doctor, and perhaps that defined my life more than I ever wanted to admit. My husband Leon worked as a surgeon, always moving, always under pressure, always needed by everyone except me. I got used to empty mornings, lonely dinners, the constant waiting for his keys in the door, my only daily ritual. At times it felt like I wasn't living with a person, but with his shadow, which appeared for only a few hours before disappearing again into night shifts. For a long time, I convinced myself that this was enough, that love had to be patient, that support meant silence rather than presence. But one day something inside me cracked. Not loudly, quietly, almost invisibly, like a fracture in glass that widens over time. It was during that period that I met Marcel, a client of the gallery where I worked. He was attentive, focused, with a rare ability to see people more clearly than they saw themselves. At first, he was just an acquaintance, then someone with whom I spent far too much time, even though I had no right to. I wasn't looking for betrayal. It came gradually, like a warm breeze that barely touches your skin at first, then suddenly turns into flame. We began meeting outside the gallery. Walks, coffee, evenings that lasted longer than they should have. With him, I felt something I had almost forgotten. That I was alive, that I could be desired, that someone looked at me not through exhaustion, but with interest. When everything crossed the line, I knew there would be no turning back. And yet I took that step, as if with someone else's legs. After that night, my life split in two. Before and after. Before me who waited, after me who hid. Guilt settled inside me immediately. It wasn't sharp, but sticky, slow, relentless. I would wake up at night feeling like I couldn't breathe, not from fear of being caught, but from the fact that I had crossed my own boundaries. I knew Leon didn't deserve this. His exhaustion was honest, his absence not contempt. He was simply a man who saved others and didn't realize he was losing me. One day he found a postcard from Marcel in my bag. Nothing special. A short message. A few warm words. No clear evidence. But it was enough. The world in his eyes changed. He didn't say anything, and that silence became the worst punishment. Since then, our home turned into a place where two strangers lived. We behaved carefully, as if any movement could shatter each other. He was silent. I was too. We both tiptoed among the fragments of our marriage. I stopped seeing Marcel, not because he disappeared, because I could no longer look at him, knowing it had cost me part of myself. Now I live in a constant state of waiting, whether Leon and I can ever return to each other, or whether this silence will destroy everything for good. I don't know. But I know this. Betrayal did not give me freedom. It gave me a truth I was afraid to face. I had been lonely long before I ever betrayed him. And now I am no longer sure whether a wound like this can heal, the kind made not by the absence of love, but by the absence of ourselves within it. After the day Leon found the postcard, the distance between us began to grow faster than I could comprehend. At first, I thought it was temporary, that he simply needed time, like a doctor after a difficult surgery. But the silence that settled between us didn't heal. It was empty, cold, like a room that hadn't seen light in a long time. Leon began staying at work even when he didn't have shifts. He came home later than ever, as if deliberately avoiding any moment he might end up next to me. I saw how he became more withdrawn. No smiles, no half-playful glances that once filled our everyday life. Only fatigue, focus, and a new hardness that had never been there before. I started noticing that he barely touched anything at home. His presence was minimal, precise movements that left no trace, as if he was afraid to anchor himself in a space he no longer considered his own. His mug stood exactly where I left it in the morning, untouched, empty. His shirts disappeared from our closet. He had clearly moved some clothes to the hospital so he'd have an excuse to come home even less. I felt him slipping away from me like water through my fingers. Where there used to be familiarity, there was emptiness. Where once we built our home together, now only I remained, as if he had left this territory to me but forbade himself from being part of it. At some point I realized he had stopped even observing me. Before, His attention had been subtle but all-encompassing, a gaze that caught the slightest shift in my mood or noticed when I was sad. Now he looked past me, as if I had turned translucent. That indifference cut deeper than any words. I tried to behave as if I could restore the rhythm of our former life. I cooked dinners he left untouched, placed flowers he didn't notice, tidied rooms he hadn't entered in weeks. It felt like a ritual meant to remind me that our world still existed. But in truth, it was slowly collapsing. Sometimes I heard him waking at night and sitting in the dark hallway for a long time. He thought I was asleep, but the silence was so dense I could feel his every movement. I knew he was replaying our years together, searching for moments where he might have lost something or failed to see it. He felt as if he had lost a game whose rules he never understood, and I felt that my greatest betrayal wasn't the act itself, but the silence that led to it. One morning I realized that we almost no longer overlapped in time. He left before I woke up and returned after I had already turned off the lights. Our lives began existing in different time zones, even though we lived under the same roof. Gradually, the apartment turned into a place where I waited for someone who no longer arrived. I didn't know whether he would ever want to be near me again, or whether this silence was his way of preparing us for the end. He didn't say a word, but his silence carried the weight of a sentence, and I began to fear that one day he might simply stop coming back at all, and I would remain among the things that reminded me of a love that slowly faded because it couldn't withstand what I had done. I had been closing my eyes to what was happening for a long time. I kept telling myself that Leon was just going through something, distancing himself temporarily, trying to gather his thoughts. But one morning everything became so unmistakably clear that even my denial could no longer obscure it. He was almost no longer at home. At first, he began staying overnight at the hospital under the pretext of being overworked. Then came weekends spent elsewhere, and eventually, I noticed that he only came back to pick up the things he needed. His movements were precise, like those of someone who knows the value of each minute and spends it deliberately. He no longer behaved as if this home was his refuge. Now it was a place he entered only to fulfill a formality. One day I saw his suitcase by the door, small, almost empty, but it was enough to understand. He no longer slept here. He never said it aloud, but his belongings disappeared week by week. The bar of his favorite chocolate I used to buy for him remained untouched. His books no longer lay on the bedside table. Even the scent of his cologne vanished from the pillow. What had once been our reality turned into a museum of the past. I learned about his new life gradually, almost accidentally. Posts on colleagues' social media where he appeared in work photos with a new lightness in his eyes. Mentions from acquaintances that he was often in the city center, now at conferences, grabbing coffee after shifts, spending time with people I didn't know. These were small clues, but together they formed a picture. He was building something new, a life in which I no longer had a place. I noticed a faint trace of someone else's perfume on his shirts, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Perhaps it was just a colleague. Perhaps someone he had allowed to come closer. I had no right to ask, no right to know. I had lost my place beside him, not when I betrayed him, but when I stopped being home for him. I often stayed in the kitchen in the evenings with the lights off, listening to the silence. It was different from before, not tense, final. I no longer felt his presence in the air, as if someone had wiped away everything that carried his imprint. I realized he had started living as if he had already made a choice. Living outside the home, outside of me, outside the promises we once made. He didn't seek conflict, didn't demand explanations, didn't set conditions. He simply began moving on quietly, confidently, irreversibly. At some point, I understood that I no longer knew where he spent his nights. I didn't know who heard him laugh now. I didn't know whether he thought of me at all, or whether our marriage had become just a piece of his biography he no longer wished to reread. I was a page turned too early, and each time I tidied our bedroom, I felt as if I were maintaining the illusion of a home that no longer existed. He was building a new one somewhere, in a sturdier part of his life, where there was no longer any space for me. And I remained here, in an empty space that had once been love, now a reminder that sometimes people leave not because they stop loving, but because they can no longer stay in the place where they were broken. Leon began disappearing from home so often that silence became my only companion. I noticed how his belongings were gradually migrating into another life, first the books he used to read before bed, then a few sets of clothes, and eventually his work documents that had always lain on the kitchen table. He seemed to dissolve a little more each day, leaving behind only the outline of the men with whom I had once built a future. I felt my home, once filled with his presence, turning into a place of waiting. I wandered through the hallways that no longer held any meaning, unsure where to put my hands, my thoughts, my guilt. Everything was moving toward a logical ending, slow but inevitable. Our shared things no longer felt shared. Our past no longer felt ours. The papers from the legal office arrived unexpectedly. I held the thin folder in my hands, yet it weighed more than any guilt inside me. Inside it was the formalized end of what I had destroyed by my own actions. The marriage was entering the phase of divorce, and it sounded cold, almost technical, though in reality it was raw and painful. I felt a strange emptiness, not the kind that tears you apart, but the kind that dulls everything unnecessary, quieting the heart to a barely perceptible beat. It felt as if I were standing on the threshold of two lives, one that had already lost its meaning, and another that had not yet formed even a silhouette. Meanwhile, Leon was building his new reality outside our walls. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he looked calmer, as if he had finally stopped fighting invisible shadows. Perhaps I had been one of them. He was distancing himself completely, without dramatic gestures, yet with the unmistakable certainty of someone who no longer wished to return to the past. Our lives were splitting along quiet but deep fractures. We were no longer us, yet I still sometimes woke up with the illusion that I could go back to the moment when betrayal was only a thought, not an action that erased everything. Now all that remained was to walk the final stretch, without a fight, without scenes, only with the quiet acceptance that sometimes we become the destroyers of our own homes. The last few weeks before the official end of our marriage passed with an oddly steady calm. I no longer had space for despair, only a quiet exhaustion mixed with a reluctance to revisit what could no longer be changed. I moved forward not because I wanted to, but because time relentlessly pushed me ahead. Leon and I now communicated only through letters from our lawyers. There was no anger or pain in them, just a cold formality describing the division of a life into parts, as if we were negotiating the fate of inanimate objects. Our house was to go to me, his new apartment to him. We divided our belongings as though trying to avoid unnecessary attachments. Each of us kept what mattered least, yet his jacket still hung in the closet, untouched, and I couldn't bring myself to move it. I often returned to the bedroom, where the first fractures of our life had appeared. The sheets had long been replaced, the furniture rearranged, but the space still held the imprint of days gone by. I was learning to sleep alone, to fall asleep without the outline of another person beside me. Even the pillows felt foreign, as though they were waiting for something that would never come again. Gradually, I began packing boxes, not for a move, but to keep only what would allow me to continue. I placed photographs, postcards, and small memories into them, trying not to touch anything for too long, so as not to dissolve into the past. Some things I simply threw away, feeling a strange relief I hadn't expected. Leon was already living at a different pace. It was clear he had let me go long before we ceased to be husband and wife. Our paths no longer crossed. We had become two separate points that once formed a single shape but now existed on different coordinates. And although I knew it was fair, I was still hurt by the ease with which he moved forward. The day of signing the papers approached as inevitably as a wave that cannot be stopped by hand. I often woke at night with the sense that time was contracting, that something in my life was ending irreversibly. It wasn't fear, something deeper. A farewell to the version of myself who had existed next to him. I became more attentive to small things, the light falling through the window in the morning, the silence, now my constant companion, the rhythm of my own breathing, reminding me that I was still here. Slowly and cautiously, I began to feel life without Leon, as if learning to walk again. Ahead was the final page of our shared life. I didn't know if I would find the strength to turn it, but I knew it was already written and there was very little left before the final stroke. The day of the final signature began unusually quiet. I woke earlier than usual and sat for a long time at the edge of the bed, listening to the emptiness of the room. It felt as though the house held its breath with me. I didn't feel panic or pain, only a cold clarity that appears when life changes direction. I went to the courthouse early, though there was no reason to rush. I held a small bag in my hands as if it could give me balance. The road felt too familiar, too ordinary for such a day. I watched through the window and caught myself thinking that the world didn't notice the storm inside me. People hurried to work, someone carried flowers, someone spoke on the phone, while I was on my way to say goodbye to a part of my life, and it felt like such a lonely mission that I wanted to hide from my own thoughts. Leon was already there. I sensed his presence before I saw him. He was standing aside, holding a folder of documents, appearing the same as always, calm, composed, detached. I didn't approach him. I didn't want to disturb the silence that had existed between us for so long. We no longer shared even the small space of the waiting room. The procedure was quick, almost mechanical. Papers, signatures, formalities, everything moved as if it no longer needed us. When it was my turn to sign, I hesitated for a moment, pen hovering in the air. It was in doubt, more a desire to acknowledge, here is the boundary, and beyond it I will no longer be who I was. The signature came out smooth, even elegant, like on an exam form. I looked at it and felt something inside me break quietly, without sound, but irreversibly. It didn't hurt. It simply became empty. Leon and I left the room in different directions. I didn't look back at him, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew the past wasn't following me anymore. It remained where we placed the final period. Outside, a sharp cold wind blew. I stopped on the steps, inhaled deeply, and suddenly realized it was my first breath as a free person. Not in the sense of being free from Leon, no. Free from the version of myself who had made a mistake and remained trapped in it. Ahead lay a road I had never seen. Returning home, I paused for a moment in the hallway. The apartment felt strange, empty, too spacious. I stood in the silence, as if among the ruins of a former life, and finally allowed myself peace. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, I felt that I had the right to place my own first period, not just the last one in the story I had destroyed. The first days after the divorce felt like a long, gray season between seasons. There were no dramatic upheavals, no sudden lightness, only a slow adjustment to a new version of myself. Every morning I would wake up and, for a moment, forget that everything was already behind me. Only after a few seconds would the silence of the apartment remind me life had changed for good. I tried to return to my usual rhythm, but there was no usual anymore. Everything was different, from the way I made my coffee to the way I closed the door when stepping outside. I used to listen for the sound of Leon locking it, turning the key. Now those sounds existed only in memory. I began spending more time outside. The city lived its indifferent yet steady life. I wandered its streets for hours, feeling a strange freedom, one that didn't comfort me yet, but didn't frighten me either. It was a freedom like a blank sheet of paper, not white from purity, but white from uncertainty. After a few weeks, I returned to work. The office rhythm restored a sense of structure. My colleagues didn't know the details, and I didn't seek to share them. It was enough that work didn't demand moral decisions. It only required tasks to be completed. In the evenings, I came home and switched on the lamp in the corner of the living room, as if its light could give the room at least some meaning. I sorted through the boxes, took photos off the shelves, the ones I could no longer look at every day, and placed them in a drawer. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I wanted to give the memories a place where they wouldn't sting. One day, I finally decided to remove his jacket, which still hung in the hallway. I picked it up, felt the fading scent that had almost disappeared, and placed it into a box for things that would one day find a new home. It wasn't an emotional moment, not a farewell to the past. It was simply a necessary step, almost technical, yet important. Gradually, I began to feel a little stronger. Loneliness hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt threatening. It didn't suffocate anymore. It merely reminded me that time heals not sharply, but millimeter by millimeter. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The morning sunlight falling on the windowsill, the smell of fresh bread from the shop around the corner, people laughing for no reason, Small fleeting moments that once got lost in the shadow of our unrest. Sometimes a wave of guilt washed over me, not the sharp kind that tore at me once, but a quiet, conscious one. It was a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. I learned to accept it like a scar, not pretty, but no longer painful. I didn't yet know whether I would ever fully forgive myself, but at some point, I realized that life doesn't demand immediate answers. It simply moves forward, and I must move with it slowly, uncertainly, but still moving. Months passed before I understood that it wasn't just my reality that had changed, I had changed too. Life no longer felt like a series of losses. It began to resemble a path where every step mattered, even if it was small and unsure. One morning, I woke up and felt that the silence no longer frightened me. It had become part of me, my choice, not a punishment. I drank my coffee, looked out the window, and suddenly realized that I hadn't thought about the past for a long time. It no longer grabbed me by the throat, no longer haunted me daily. It simply existed like a chapter I had read, understood, and closed. I wasn't looking for new relationships, nor trying to fill the emptiness with someone else. And I realized that was good. I didn't have to rush. For the first time in a long while, I felt no guilt, no regret, only a quiet calm that had arrived so gently I hadn't noticed it at first. Occasionally, news about Leon reached me through mutual acquaintances. I learned that he had settled into his new apartment, worked a lot, looked happier, and inside me, nothing painful stirred. There was only the understanding that we had each followed the paths we were always meant to take separately. I learned to love the rituals I created anew: evening walks down small streets, reading in cafes, weekend trips out of town. My life no longer felt like the debris of a former one. It became independent, quiet, honest, real. One day, as I stepped outside, I suddenly paused on the threshold. The air was cool, the sun soft, and I felt something inside me finally settle into place. Not because I had forgotten or erased the past, but because I had accepted it. My story with Leon had ended the day we put down the final signature, but my own life had not. And now I knew something else lay ahead, perhaps bright, perhaps difficult, but certainly new. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to welcome it. I closed the door and walked forward, without fear, without the shadow trailing behind me, only with a silence that no longer felt empty, and with a heart that finally beat evenly. It was my new beginning, and it arrived exactly when I learned to stand on my own feet.